The morning sun broke slow over the plains, spilling a copper light that clung to the dust rising in the town square. It should have been a quiet hour, with roosters calling and shutters creaking open, but instead the silence was ripped apart by the crack of a whip. The sound split the air like a gunshot, and children's cries followed it, high and sharp, as if the earth itself winced. Caleb Rawlins pulled his horse to a halt at the edge of the square. He had meant only to pass through, to trade feed and return to the stillness of his ranch, but the sight before him held him in place. A woman stood tied against the post, wrists bound rough, her dark hair loose and wild around her face. She did not cry out when the leather struck her. She only lowered her eyes, swallowing the pain with a stubborn, broken dignity. Beside her clung 2 children, a girl of about 10, her cheeks wet with furious tears, and a boy smaller, hiding his face against her skirts. The girl's voice cut through the muttering crowd. "They are whipping Mama for birthing us." It was not just a child's cry. It was an accusation, thrown like a stone into the hearts of every man and woman who stood watching. Caleb felt it hit his own chest and sink deep, heavy as an anvil. The sheriff, Amos Pike, stood near the post, his hand resting at his hip, as though his pistol needed guarding. His voice carried sharp. Eliza May Carson brought shame upon this town. Better her children learn now what kind of woman birthed them. The crowd shifted uneasy. No one stepped forward. No one spoke. Their silence was its own kind of cruelty, a knife turned inward. Caleb's horse stamped, restless, as though it too felt the sour taste of the morning. He swung down slowly, boots striking dust. His hat brim shadowed his eyes, but inside his chest burned a heat he could not swallow back. He remembered another woman, his late wife, Mary, who once bore whispers for marrying him when he had nothing but calloused hands and a shack barely worth living in. He remembered the way shame carved itself into her smile, though she had done no wrong. And standing there, he thought, silence now would be a sin. Without asking permission, Caleb moved to the post. His fingers, scarred from years of fence wire and plow handles, worked at the knots binding Eliza's wrists. The crowd murmured louder. Someone hissed. Someone else spat at the dirt. Eliza lifted her head, startled, her eyes meeting his. They were dark and wide, brimming with both defiance and shame, but she did not speak. She simply held her children close with her gaze, even as Caleb freed her hands. The ropes fell. She staggered, but caught herself, pride holding her straighter than bone could. The sheriff's jaw tightened, but he did not move, not yet. The girl, Clara, pressed herself against her mother's side, sobbing hard now with relief, and the little boy clutched her skirts with both fists. Caleb stepped back, slow and steady. He could feel the heat of the town's eyes on him, heavy as branding irons. He knew what this meant, what it cost. But when he glanced once more at the woman, her arms wrapping those children as though she could shield them from the whole world, he knew there was no other road to walk. That evening, the ranch house smelled faintly of smoke and dust, the kind of place that never fully scrubbed itself clean. Caleb brought them there, without words. The ride had been silent, the children half asleep against their mother's sides, her eyes fixed on the horizon as though afraid to look back. Inside, the stove creaked with an old fire. Eliza eased down onto a wooden chair, her wrists red and raw from the ropes. She tended to them herself, wrapping scraps of cloth around the bruises. She did not thank him, not in words, but she lifted her face once, and in her gaze there was something steadier than gratitude. It was the look of someone who had learned too well how to carry her own pain and could not quite set it down. Caleb clattered pots in the kitchen corner, rough and clumsy. He was no cook, but he made a stew with what he had. The smell of boiling beans and onions rose, filling the silence with something homely. Clara leaned toward her brother, whispering, "Mama don't have to cry tonight." Her words pressed themselves into Caleb's chest, leaving a mark no whip could. Later, when the children slept huddled under a single quilt, Eliza rose quietly and found his torn coat draped over a chair. Without a word, she took needle and thread from her bag and began mending it, the lamplight catching her steady fingers. Caleb watched from the shadows, saying nothing. Some things grew only in silence. Days fell into a rhythm. Josiah followed Caleb to the stables, his small hands trying to mimic the rancher's steady care with the horses. Clara ran wild in the fields, her laughter sharp as a meadowlark's cry, though her eyes still flicked warily whenever she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats. Eliza worked beside Caleb in quiet strength, hauling water, feeding hens, scrubbing what could be scrubbed. The town, meanwhile, did not stay silent. Gossips spilled from the saloon, from church porches, from lips that had once welcomed Caleb Rawlins as a neighbor. Margaret Whitfield, a widow with a sharp tongue, came by to warn him, her voice carrying both judgment and a reluctant trace of concern. "You'll ruin yourself keeping her here. Folks don't forget a woman's shame so easy." Caleb only tipped his hat, saying nothing, though his jaw worked hard. That night, he found biscuits left at his place at the table, Eliza's doing. She offered no explanation. He did not ask. As summer stretched on, the air between them softened. He caught her humming once, soft lullabies she sang to the children, her voice carrying like wind through tall grass. She saw him watching and stopped, but the song lingered in the rafters long after. One evening, beneath the stars, Caleb worked at a broken fence. Eliza stood nearby, holding the lantern. They said little, yet the silence between them felt safe, like something shared rather than empty. When their hands brushed as he reached for a tool, neither pulled away quickly. But shadows grew long across their fragile peace. Amos Pike did not forget his humiliation in the square. He rode out one morning, his deputy at his side, dust billowing behind him. He reined his horse hard at the ranch gate, calling out with a voice meant to carry. "These children don't belong here. They'll not grow wild like weeds on your land, Rawlins. Best hand him over now before law forces it." Caleb stepped forward, steady as a stone. His voice was low, but every word cut clear. "You'll not lay a hand on them again." The sheriff shifted in the saddle, fingers brushing the handle of his pistol. Dust swirled, tension thick as storm air. Eliza pulled Clara and Josiah close, whispering prayers, her body trembling though her chin lifted. For a long moment, the standoff held, man against man, silence against threat. Then Pike spat to the side, tugged his reins, and wheeled his horse away, leaving only dust and the promise of trouble. That night, Clara crept to Caleb's chair by the fire. Her eyes were wide, glimmering in the glow. "Don't let them take Mama again," she whispered. Caleb looked at her, this child with a fire far too old in her voice, and answered steady, the promise not just to her but to all of them, "You'll never face alone." The ranch did not fall silent after that day. It only learned a different kind of quiet, the kind that carried the weight of watchful eyes. Trade came slower, neighbors turned their wagons aside, and doors in town shut when Caleb entered. Yet life pressed forward in small, stubborn ways. The wheat still bent in the wind, cattle still lowed in the distance, and the children still laughed when the sun was warm enough to chase shadows. But Eliza may bore the silence harder than Caleb did. At night, when the house slept, she stood at the window, her face half hidden in the glow of moonlight. She would stare toward town as if she could hear the whispers carried on the wind. Caleb, from his chair by the dying fire, saw her silhouette framed in pale silver, and he recognized it, the posture of someone bracing against shame she had not earned. He had lived with silence before after Mary's death. He knew how it hollowed a house. And so he began with small offerings. A carved wooden horse for Josiah, clumsy but bright with the boy's joy. A whittled whistle for Clara, who tried and tried until she laughed breathless at the sound she finally made. For Eliza, there were no gifts he dared place in her hands, but when she woke in the cold night, she found a shawl across her shoulders, warm from his touch. The days wove them together more tightly than words could. Josiah followed Caleb step for step, learning how to scatter feed with careful hands. Clara grew bold enough to run with the calves in the pasture, hair flying wild, her mother calling after her with a laugh that startled even herself. And Eliza, though her eyes still carried shadows, began to hum openly as she worked, low songs that filled the house like balm on a wound. Yet the town's judgment grew louder. At church, Amos Pike stood stiff-backed, his sermon sharp with barbs. Eliza had not dared set foot there in months, but one Sunday morning, Caleb saddled his horse and said only, "We'll ride." The children's eyes shone, their hands eager for his. Inside the church, the air thickened with whispers. Heads turned. Women drew their shawls closer. Amos's voice thundered from the pulpit, "Sin has no place among the righteous." His gaze fixed on Eliza, his words meant to slice. Caleb stood. The wooden pew creaked beneath him. He took off his hat, held it against his chest, and then, slow, deliberate, he knelt beside the children. His voice shook, but it carried through the hush. "Lord, bless these little ones. Bless their mother, who's borne more than any woman should. And if there's shame to be carried, let it fall on me, not them." A stillness fell, heavy and unexpected. Amos's mouth tightened, but no one joined him. Even Margaret Whitfield, who had once spat her gossip like seeds in the wind, shifted in her seat, eyes downcast. Eliza's hands trembled, but for the first time in years, her shoulders straightened. She walked out of that church with her chin high, her children pressed close, Caleb at her side. But Amos Pike was not a man to loosen his grip easily. That night, torches bobbed against the horizon. A crowd gathered, their voices low and angry, like a storm rising. They came to the ranch with Sheriff Pike at their head, his face red with fury. Caleb stood in the doorway, rifle resting in his hands, but angled toward the earth. Behind him, Eliza clutched her children, her breath sharp as she tried to steady them. "You've sheltered shame long enough," Pike barked, his voice thick with rage. "Hand the brats over before law takes them." The crowd muttered in agreement, but not with the conviction of true belief. Some looked uneasy, shifting their torches from hand to hand. Caleb stepped forward, the firelight painting his face in harsh lines. He did not raise his gun. Instead, he raised his voice, deep and steady, carrying like the wind across dry grass. "You call it shame," he said, "but I've seen shame, and it's not a woman raising her children. Shame is men who watch a whip fall and do nothing. Shame is calling yourself righteous while you break the back of someone already bowed. My Mary once carried that same scorn when she chose me over men with more coin. I buried her with that weight, and I'll not see another woman broken by your cowardice." He turned to the crowd, his eyes sweeping over them. "Every man here has scars he'd rather hide. Every woman has secrets she keeps from the dark. But you'll burn this house down because this one carries hers in the open? You think that makes you holy? It only makes you cruel." Eliza stepped beside him then, her face pale but her eyes lit with something fierce. Her voice, though quiet, cut through the night. "My children will not be punished for the breath God gave them. They are mine, and I will stand until I cannot stand at all." Clara, trembling but proud, moved forward too. "We ain't afraid," she said, though her small voice shook. Josiah pressed against her hand, nodding silently. The mob faltered. Margaret Whitfield, standing near the front, suddenly lifted her chin. "Enough, Amos," she called. "You've no right. Not tonight, not ever." A murmur rippled. One by one, torches dipped lower. Men shifted their weight, shame creeping into their faces. The firelight that had once seemed threatening now flickered uncertain, fragile. Pike's face twisted red, but the tide had turned. He spat at the dirt, cursed under his breath, and wheeled his horse hard. The mob broke apart, leaving only smoldering torches abandoned in the dust. When silence returned, it was deep, like the earth itself had exhaled. The dawn that followed was golden and gentle, as though the world had been remade overnight. The fields stretched wide beneath a sky washed clean. At the ranch, Eliza moved with new steadiness, her hands sure as she fed the hens, her face no longer turned from the light. Clara laughed freely now, chasing calves across the pasture. Josiah rode his wooden horse with a grin too big for his face. Even Margaret appeared at the gate one morning, quieter than usual, carrying a loaf of bread still warm from her oven. She did not offer apology, but the gesture spoke louder. Caleb and Eliza worked side by side, their shadows long across the fields. Between them stretched not romance declared, but something quieter, trust woven slow through acts of care and defiance shared. They spoke less than they felt, but when their eyes met across the pasture, the silence hummed with promise. That evening, Clara tugged at her mother's dress. "Mama," she whispered, "we're safe now." Eliza bent, kissed her daughter's forehead, and answered soft but steady, because some folks know how to stand when it matters. And Caleb, watching from the porch, felt the weight of her words settle into him like roots in soil. Years later, the story would be told around fires. The night a rancher stood, not with a gun, but with words, and turned a mob aside. But in that moment, with dawn spilling like honey across the fields and laughter rising from children once silenced, it was enough simply to breathe. And if you are listening now, know this: we are all, at times, the outcast tied to the post, waiting for mercy. And we are all, at times, the ones holding the rope or the torch. But if you choose to stand beside the shamed, if you choose kindness over silence, then no soul ever truly faces alone. And that, friends, is how the West grew its truest heroes.